Thank you very much for staying this long. It has been a very long day, so we appreciate your staying for this session. We think, however, it is a very important session because research integrity is really at the heart of what society expects from academia and scholarly publishing. And as you're probably aware, we're facing a growing challenge in the academic ecosystem. Paper mills are increasingly submitting and publishing fake content. Publishers are retracting more and more of their content, and generative AI allows bad actors to create fake content on an unprecedented scale. And as the mainstream media has picked up on the issue, awareness of the problem has entered public consciousness. You might have seen the articles in the New York Times, in the Economist, and the Times of London about paper mills and the eroding trust on scholarly research. So it's really an enormous challenge that we are facing. And our publishers are, of course, heavily engaged with these challenges. More and more integrity specialists are being employed by publishers, investigating submitted as well as published material, in many cases leading to retractions. Increasingly, manuscripts are screened at the moment of submission, often aided by software, sophisticated technology, for example, looking at plagiarism, but also increasingly at manipulated images and generated text. In addition to these efforts of individual publishers, the Integrity Hub was launched. It was mentioned a few times yesterday as well, in response to these large challenges. How do we do that? It's a combination of shared data, of experiences, harnessing technological innovation. It's crucial in combating integrity issues. The Integrity Hub offers a collaborative approach to detect research integrity offending manuscripts by publishers at submission, preventing them from entering the scholarly record. So concretely, the Integrity Hub does that in 3 ways. First of all, we create a safe space for publishers to share knowledge and experiences, bringing everyone together, allowing them to exchange their data and information about bad practices. Often, of course, one of the impediments we have is we work in a very siloed way. So by publishers, by allowing them to collaborate better, that certainly helps solving this issue. We're also developing legal and policy frameworks, making sure that everything we do is within, of course, the legal and the policy bounds, also providing guidance for editors on how to deal with integrity issues. And last but not least, we are building a cloud-based environment for publishers to check submitted articles for research integrity issue, of course, consistent with the laws and the industry best practices and fully respecting the laws and ethics of data privacy and competition antitrust laws. In this environment, publishers are also increasingly using each other's softwares, so they can develop and operate screening tools for the benefit of the entire scholarly communications ecosystem. So very quickly, where are we now? This year we launched 2 tools. One is a paper mill checker tool. It allows publishers to upload submitted manuscripts and screen for several signals, looking at the references, looking at the text, looking at tortured phrases, for example. Did any of the references appear in the POPIR database, giving the ethics specialist and the publishers a signal if something suspicious comes up, so further investigation can be done, and in case it is a paper mill, then it can be rejected immediately. We also launched something which is quite new, is a duplicate submission checker. So we build a system allowing publishers to see if a submission is submitted to multiple journals at the same time across journals, publishers, and submission systems. And that is very important because that's how paper mills work. They just submit them as manuscripts to 30 journals at the same time, hoping one of them will accept them. And it's the first time we now as an industry are able to detect duplicate submissions and reject them, and if, again, there is no good reason for that to appear. However, publishers are only part of the solution. The recognition that research integrity is a collective responsibility for the entire scholarly ecosystem is gaining momentum. And it was also mentioned yesterday in the opening session with Roger Sunfeld. This urgent need for cooperation was also highlighted during a summit focused on paper mills. This was organized with COPE and STM in spring of this year. We brought together 40 representatives from government bodies, publishers, academic institutions, agencies, and research integrity specialists. And this summit was a response on a report on paper mills, which STM published in 2022 together with COPE, where we explained the problem and the size of the issues we're facing. As a result of this meeting, the United to Act Summit, as we called it, we developed working groups that will address at least several areas. Again, ensuring that the entire ecosystem is working on the challenges we're facing on the level of research integrity. 4 areas are looking at new approaches for retractions, support on so-called trust markers, and we will explain later what they are, more awareness on research integrity and the risks of using paper mills, and more research on paper mills. So today we want to discuss research integrity as a collective responsibility and discuss how institutions, but specifically librarians, can optimally engage in these efforts. Librarians, of course, possess unique characteristics and skills that can significantly contribute to ensuring the integrity of scholarly records. I talked to somebody yesterday and they called librarians our natural allies in these efforts of integrity. So appreciate you didn't go to the ChatGPT session, but I do want to mention it because I looked up what is a librarian according to ChatGPT, and it came up with the following. Academic librarians play a crucial role in supporting the academic mission in their institutions by providing access to information, fostering information literacy, and serving as partners in teaching and research. Their roles continue to evolve as they adapt to changes in technology and the evolving needs of students and faculty. So, to what extent is research integrity one of those evolving needs? Could the scholarly ecosystem better benefit from their experience and tap into their potential to effectively address the challenges posed by threats to research integrity, including paper mills? So today we're going to discuss these matters with a fantastic panel consisting of Rick Anderson. Rick is University Librarian at Brigham Young University and one of the chefs of the Scholarly Kitchen. Gwen Evans, Vice President Global Library Relations at Elsevier and an ex-librarian. We have Kathleen Bakker, I pronounce it in the Dutch way, Discovery Technologies Librarian, University of Regina, and co-chair of the NISO-GREC working group, which is the communications of retractions, removals, and expressions of concern. And last but not least, Daniel Kulp. He's the chair of COPE, the Committee of Publication Ethics. So my name is Joris Van Rossum. I am the program director at STM Solutions, which is the operational arm of STM, the Global Association of Scientific Technical Medical Publishers, and I'm responsible for the Integrity Hub. So when we discuss research integrity with the panel, and later hopefully with you as well, we will discuss certain themes, but we start downstream. The whole paradigm is that we, of course, we detect integrity issues as soon as possible and preferably prevent it. So the whole philosophy is to go from curing to prevention, which I hope you agree is the optimal preferred process. So first we go into some Q&A, some questions going to, and I will use the themes of the United to Act working groups as a start, and then I will we have some room for question and answers as well. So I want to start with Dan Kulp. Dan, in 2022, COPE announced the launch of the COPE membership for universities, institutions, besides publishers. Could you tell us more about the reasons to do that and the background and the decision to make institutions a member, and maybe a bit about the progress of that program?
So thank you, Joris. So before I talk about our expansion of COPE membership to universities and research institutions, maybe I should give you a little background on COPE itself, because I think you'll see as I talk a little bit about what COPE's focus has been during its lifespan, you'll see how this is sort of a very natural evolution of the conversation on integrity and ethics. So COPE started 26 years ago just as a group of 3 or 4 medical editors who wanted to get together to talk about common issues that they were seeing within their journals, common ethical issues. And so what has been just a brief conversation amongst individuals has grown substantially. So in the early 2000s, it became a registered charity in the UK and has continued to expand into an international organization. Currently, we have over 13,500 journals as members of COPE. What we do is we provide sort of education and guidance to help editors and journals primarily reach sort of an ethical endpoint, right? How to create an ethical journal, how to proceed and process things in an appropriate ethical manner. That has very much traditionally been our position, as well as facilitate conversations amongst these journals, facilitate conversations between people with concerns about the journals. But as you can see, as we've heard, I think, especially throughout today and some of the earlier conversations on research integrity, it's really publication ethics and publication integrity is really just a small piece of an entire research ecosystem, right, that goes well beyond. In some ways, publication is, can be thought of as almost an endpoint of a research program, right? There's a lot that goes into place beforehand. And so COPE, in its attempt to expand the conversation and facilitate and sort of bring the publication world into a more ethical place, it was clear that it has to move further upstream. It has to move to a place where researchers are being educated, researchers are being taught to show that by doing ethical research practices, it'll lead to ethical publication. So we started this conversation probably 7 years ago. It was a complex issue as to how to bring universities in, because one of the first things we found is that there was a general lack of communication and understanding of the roles between what journals and publishers do, what are they responsible for, how do they act, and the way universities, especially with the research integrity units, how do they act? What do they move forward? Where does confidentiality come from? There was a lot of arguments like, the journals have sort of a contract with the authors. So they try to resolve issues with the authors if complaints are made. Universities, they interact with their researchers, right? And they try to make sure things work well in that environment. The problem was what happens at that intersection. The universities would complain, well, if you go to the authors first, they'll be able to hide data. We won't be able to encapsulate it, bring it, sort of capture that information. They'll be able to hide it. So you have to come to us first. But then the journals, when they receive complaints or concerns, our natural reaction is to believe that most people are, acting ethically. So therefore, you want to have that interaction first and not escalate to the employer or to the university. And so this is sort of where the thought began to expand is, one, how do we expand the conversation? How do we facilitate the communication? And then start looking at then what are the expectations of the university within the ecosystem of publishing ethics. If we were to bring a university in as a member, what are their expectations? What are our expectations? And this also gives us an opportunity where we've been talking about education and training. We have a lot of experience in publication ethics. How can we bring in our material and our knowledge to the universities to help support their educational programs, to produce ethical scholars, ethical researchers? And so that was sort of the way it started. In an attempt to see how it would work, we introduced the program in a pilot stage and invited about a dozen universities to join. We're now going to the second phase of the pilot. We've actually put out invitations to 10 more universities, and these are international. We have a pretty good spread in Hong Kong, Australia, US, UK, around the world. And then in 2024, we're just going to open up the gates and allow all universities who might be interested in participating in this way to join COPE and be part of the conversation. So that's really where we are now. We're hopeful that it will slowly gain speed. We don't know if we've opened floodgates, but we will certainly react appropriately depending on how it goes.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll get back to the engagement with institutions via COPE. So again, we go from downstream to upstream. So let's start absolutely downstream when something has been retracted. And the challenges to communicate that retraction, especially with open access content, where of course copies can float around. Kathleen, you have been working on that on a working group. Could you tell us a bit about the intentions and the status?
Thank you. Okay, good, it is on. Yeah, so I want to maybe take a step back and talk about sort of what the problem is that we're trying to solve and why inconsistent representation of retracted status actually matters. Because we might assume that once something is discredited, people sort of know that it has been discredited and therefore it no longer gets perpetuated. What we actually see is not that at all. When we look at the post-retraction citation of that retracted material, so this is after the decision has been made to retract something, we see that only about 5% of those citations actually refute the findings of the study or indicate that they are aware of the fact that the study has been retracted. In 95% of cases, there is no awareness that is being represented, and people may be using it to support their arguments. It really may underpin and be foundational to what it is that they are trying to put forward in their research agenda. Obviously, we can't know, definitively why somebody would cite a retracted publication and not indicate that it was retracted, but I would venture to say most likely they're not aware of the fact that it's been retracted. And that's where that inconsistent representation really comes into play, because when we look at the experience that users have across databases, within single journals, we see that that representation can be hugely variable. Sometimes it's going to be in the title, sometimes it'll be in the abstract, sometimes it'll be in a controlled vocabulary term or a publication type, sometimes it might be nowhere. Sometimes there may be a retraction notice that's getting linked to, sometimes there's not. And this can be, database to database, it can vary. It can also be within the same database and even within the same journal. So users not being aware is fairly, that's kind of the logical byproduct of that. And so that's really where, the NISO-CREC working group has been focusing our energy. And I really want to emphasize, we're not talking about why things get retracted, when an expression of concern should be issued, why something should be removed. There's already great guidance on that that's available through organizations like COPE. We're really thinking about, okay, once that decision has been made, how does that information get shared? How is that intelligible to aggregators, for example, to end users, to other actors kind of within this ecosystem? So the CREC working group, to kind of engage in this work, we began with information gathering, which was kind of the majority of the time that we've spent together since May 2022 was when we launched. And we found that there was just a huge variety of workflows that were in play and of different actions that folks were taking, whether that was acting upon the PDF, do you watermark it? Do you remove the PDF entirely? Do you replace it with the retraction notice? Similar sorts of questions for the HTML and the metadata itself. And we found that every publisher kind of had its own workflow. Sometimes the same publisher would have a different workflow depending on the society that they were working with, the journal that they were working with. So there was just a lot of variation. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you have different organizations performing really complex actions, they're probably going to have different workflows. But the challenge is that there aren't these mutually intelligible end products. People are receiving information, and the metadata field doesn't always mean what you think the metadata field would mean. It's not always possible to identify what item is actually getting retracted to create those sorts of linkages. And so that's really where we wanted to kind of step in and provide some recommendations on how it is that we would like to see people engaging in this space. So we have put forward our recommended practices. They are currently in the public comment period until December 2nd. So please, public, comment. But some of our examples or some of the things that we're recommending people do are things that some end users probably already expect that they would do, like, for example, adding the word retracted to the title of a retracted publication, ensuring that there's a bidirectional link between a retracted publication and a freely available retraction notice, and that retraction notice also, again, links back to that retracted publication, ensuring that if somebody finds a retracted publication in search results, they also can see the retraction notice alongside it. And so really just ensuring that somebody does have a consistent experience, and so it doesn't matter how they arrive at the article, how they arrive at the search result, they're aware of the current status of that item. And I'll just note that I'm kind of talking about to an extent, changing the way people do things. I do want to integrate or just emphasize that we're not talking about creating additional workflows. We're not creating new metadata schema. We're really talking about how it is people can use existing workflows, their existing metadata schema, whether that's JATS or Crossref or something else, and can still leverage these recommended practices to just create that consistency and that clarity. So as I mentioned, we are currently in the public comment period. So if you go to www.niso.org/standards-committees/CREC, not that I've said that a lot of times recently, or you can just Google NISO CREC and it'll be the first hit. You can see our complete recommended practices, and there's also a link to the form where you can provide any feedback or thoughts that you may have about maybe areas that need expansion, things that we've missed. Just any feedback that you have would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you very much. Let's go a bit more upstream, and let's go now to whenever there is a concern about an article, an investigation has to be done. So contact has to be sought with the institution, and that is a frustrating process that is very lengthy, takes a lot of time, and people complain about it. Question to all of you, but maybe to start with you, Dan. So what is the current process? So the interaction of the publisher with the institution. Are librarians involved? And maybe how could we perhaps better engage with institutions to make that process more streamlined?
Yeah, I think the main concern that the journals have is that there's no consistency. Institutions don't necessarily clearly label how a journal can communicate with them. Who are the right responsible parties? So there's just that lack of step one. You know, so a journal can be lost and spend a significant amount of time doing research on the institution to try to see, do they have an office of research? Do they have a research integrity person, et cetera? So it is just, you know, in many cases, we're just at step one, trying to figure out who are the right people to contact. And I don't want to put it all on the university's side either. We've heard from universities that it has also been quite difficult to find the right contact person on the journal side. And so again, transparency of how to make those communications, who to communicate with, is probably the first problem that has to be solved before anything else.
Any of you want to comment, and maybe how from you've seen both sides as a librarian, as a publisher, and you as a librarian, any thoughts on how to potentially improve that?
I'm still a librarian. I just want to flag that. But,
I'll remember that.
it's like never tell a Marine they're a former Marine. So one of the, and before I was a librarian, I was a cultural anthropologist, and that never leaves you either. And that part of my brain got fired, so I'm going a little off script here. But in the previous session, and then thinking about this, these can be sort of technical conversations. And what I was thinking about is a lot of this, when you're talking about research integrity, is about risk mitigation. And where are the risks? And in the previous session, Lisa mentioned there's reputational risk to researchers, to the institution. And as Elsevier is a publisher with a huge health portfolio and medical information, when you're talking about risk, you're talking about risk to patients, you're talking about risks to research protocols. So when we're talking about research integrity, I think one of the questions we all need to ask ourselves to drive that collaboration is, what are the real impacts of this? And it could be medical, it could be bridges, you don't want bridges to fall down either. So I just want to flag that as the risks to whom to get at the collaboration needed and the focus needed, because, and to me, it's interesting that in all the Gen AI conversations, those risks are top of mind for people, but when you're talking about research integrity, it tends to come to a different level. So that's my off script. One of the things that just happened actually a couple of months ago was a librarian was going through their Scopus profiles, and it was part of a exercise to see whether everything was correct. And she noticed that there was an author that was claiming affiliation with her institution that was not, in fact, affiliated with the institution. Contacted the Scopus team, and they started doing and it's an index, so they're starting going through, and they contacted the journal side to say, this is a fraudulent affiliation, and they actually caught a submission in process there. So that is one very concrete example of librarians in their daily work sort of coming across that kind of what I almost think of as a backward curation of verifying information instead of, as Lisa mentioned, curating it on the way in. They're sort of looking at how it gets, the other way. And so that's a really concrete example of a librarian who caught something. And it wasn't just a fraudulent affiliation, it was also another submission in progress.
And that very interesting experience points out, I think, a really important distinction that we have to bear in mind when we talk about research integrity. And Daniel mentioned that, we assume that most people are acting in good faith and want to follow ethical standards. And I think that's absolutely true. Most people do. Unfortunately, there is a significant minority of researchers who deliberately want to deceive. This person who fraudulently claimed affiliation with an institution was not doing that ignorantly, and that wasn't an honest mistake. Retraction can reflect honest error, and it can also reflect deliberate deception. And there's a little bit of a middle ground. I feel like in my mind there are sort of three tiers. At the top tier is people who are just trying to deceive, and that's probably relatively few. And then in the middle, you've got people who are confident that their hypothesis is correct and are frustrated that the data don't seem to reflect it. And so when they tweak the data or otherwise misrepresent their research, they're not necessarily trying to convince people that something is true that is not true, but they are still unethically misrepresenting the actual outcome of their research. And then the other tier is the people who are honestly trying to tell the truth and are pursuing their research in an ethical way and presenting it honestly. And then, of course, there are gradations between those three tiers. But one of the things that I think as we move upstream and talk about prevention rather than cure, one of the real frustrations that we have in higher ed is that it's relatively easy to tell people to inform people of things that they don't know. It is relatively difficult to get people to want things that they don't want. And one of the struggles that we have in higher ed is working with that small minority of people who don't just need to be educated as to what the ethical guidelines are, but need to be helped to want to follow ethical guidelines. We don't talk a lot about moral formation in higher education. And yet, you know, higher ed is where we have an opportunity to try to, I mean, it feels so uncomfortable to talk like this, right? To try to shape the morals of future researchers. And yet, that's something that we really need to be thinking about. How exactly we do that, you know, it's a separate question.
I think sorry, go ahead.
And another, because librarians are already here, and it's less about the fraudulent. It's not about the fraudulent. It's more about, can you verify that this research is valid? And librarians are already in the research data management. They're already doing that in a lot of places. And I will tell you that the amount of, even if you require a data availability statement, there's a very low proportion of authors that will actually link you to where that data is deposited. And I remember a couple of years ago, there was a very funny Twitter chain of researchers making up data availability, you know, yeah, this license means that you can have it, but only after, you know, we put you through a round of embarrassing questions, or it means it's like, it's on a zip drive from 1984. You know, it's like, so they're very aware of the problem too. And getting on institutions or campuses to get them to deposit the data in the right repository and make it actually available with a link in the publication so people can get to that data. That is, I think, squarely within a lot of librarians' interests and responsibilities. So I would say that's another place that librarians could play a real role.
I want to come back to one of the things that was mentioned, because one of the initiatives that came out of the United to Act initiative is what we call trust markers. So it deals with the development of tools that verify the identity of authors and verify the claims of authors. And you mentioned the scope is more after the fact, but there is the ORCID, for example, develops it. That whenever a author submits a paper to a publisher, that the claims made by the authors are verified. So that, for example, the librarian verifies that that person that submits a manuscript actually works here and actually conducts the research, perhaps even. Or that when you claim a funding, that the funder will verify that. When you claim that you have an ORCID profile with 20 publications, that those are also verified by the publisher, which will give a lot of trust to the publishers when they receive manuscripts. How is your feeling about that? Could librarians or other people play a role in that? In the, again, at submission, verify the claims of the authors? You may be honest.
That would imply a level of cooperation with publishers that, and I think that about which there is a wide spectrum of views within the library profession.
Yes, I would say, but again, my question is, what's the impact of getting it wrong? And it's not just somebody's, you know, cites the wrong research. It's somebody develops a, you know, public policy based on not valid research. I would say that less common in the US because the transformative agreements and that libraries stepping into the workflows of submissions, it's pretty well developed in parts of Europe. And so they're already interfacing with researchers who are asking them, you know, what's the agreement with this publisher? Does this, my funder says I have to do this. And I do, and they're managing hundreds of these agreements. So they've already stepped into that role. So I do think potentially there's a role there. But again, it goes to that standardization issue is there's a huge burden on them to manage, you know, every flavor or agreement. So anything that standardizes that process would be a boon that would allow librarians to take that on, I think.
It could happen via the ORCID profile, not at every submission, for example. Yeah.
And I think as you know, speaking as a librarian and therefore someone who is sort of constitutionally oriented in the direction of standardization, it is frankly a little bit baffling to me that we don't have better standardization of retraction notices. I mean, it just seems intuitively obvious to me that a red watermark with the word retracted across the article would be a universally effective way of signaling retraction, as opposed to, you know, putting a sentence at the top of the page away from the text that says, by the way, this was retracted, or, you know, or any of the other myriad ways that we have of trying to signal retraction. I guess it shouldn't be baffling. You've got a large and highly decentralized marketplace of publishers, and there is no mechanism by which we can say, okay, all the publishers, this is how you're going to signal retraction from now on. But nevertheless,
Yeah.
I would say just another area a lot of librarians I'm aware of kind of work in research information management or current research information systems, where oftentimes it is the library or the librarian who are gathering the publication metadata, gathering the grants metadata of their institution. And they are essentially responsible for maintaining that scholarly record. And I think this is another space where standardization and interoperability between systems would be wonderful, because what often happens is that one person at their institution curates this wonderful data set, and they maybe flag certain issues, and they make sure that all of the affiliations are accurate. And then that data stays locally. It doesn't get pushed back into anything. The central data sources don't get cleaned. And so everybody is kind of independently curating and cleaning these data sets that are unique to their institution, with no mechanism to then share that information back and ensure that there is just a clean metadata source, there is a clean scholarly record, at least not at any sort of scale. People aren't doing that. So just another opportunity potentially for some standardization and increased interoperability so that we do have this clean, transparent data.
I want to move up another step upstream and the last stage. It's about another important priority of the United to Act initiative, which is also an important aspect of the responsibility of librarians, fostering information literacy. This is at the education and awareness pillar of the initiative, to create new educational tools and resources and to promote education and awareness activities to make researchers, journal editors, reviewers, journals, and publishers aware of the problem of paper mills. A question to you all is how indeed, how does that align with the responsibility of the publishers? And I remember Lisa mentioned before that the publishers had a natural role of curation by purchasing certain content. Of course, that disappears. So how could librarians be involved in that awareness in general about ethics and research integrity, but also perhaps on the level of the content itself? Anyone who wants to start?
Yeah. No, I think it's a very important role, right? And I think it goes back a little bit to what Rick was saying earlier about, you know, there are opportunities to present information that people may not be aware of. And you can talk about consequences, and it's a good start. But one thing we do have to be aware of is what is the more global message, right? What are the researchers who get most rewarded, right? And so we do have to work together in a collaborative way to really understand how it all fits together, because you can do all sorts of educational programs. You could talk to your researchers. You could tell them what's ethical. But if they see that the person who's getting promoted, the one who's getting big grants, the one who's pulling in money are the ones who are doing all the sexy research, and somehow 90% of the research works, which isn't, you know, as a recovering researcher myself, I know about 20% of research really comes to fruition. So, you know, what is the messaging? So I think it's an important component, but at the same time, at that place in the ecosystem, we have to be all aligned. And that's where the, you know, the educational aspects, the university and reward system, it's also how publishers and journals look at the output of that research, not just go for the sexy material, not to give more benefit of the doubt just because there's the potential of more citations, but really formulate it so that the most ethical people hopefully get the biggest rewards.
And I would say that because my actual job is explaining to the other sides, like what they don't know about the other sides, which is a lot, like you know, as a librarian, that sort of complete, accurate information, I would just say that the more you learn about the other aspects of the work on the ground, the better collaboration there will be. So engagement is key, and even a little like take a class from SSP, or, you know, go through it's harder on the library, like go ahead, take a class in a information science program, but it's like really knowing what is happening on the ground in any of the sectors is crucial to driving that engagement, where you could get standardization or something like that.
Good. So we talked about several steps upstream and how that's going to improve research integrity. We talked about retractions, the process of communicating retractions, the process of retraction. We talked about the trust markers. So can institutions and librarians support in verifying information, either via ORCID or at the moment of submission, which might be facilitated by the interaction already takes place with open access. And we talked about education. We have a few minutes left, so I wanted to make sure that if anyone else have any comments or any suggestion, other areas that we didn't talk about that librarians and institutions more broadly could support in research integrity.